So, you want to own a truck stop, buy some land off a highway exit, put up some diesel pumps, build a diner, throw in a few showers, and watch truckers pull in around the clock. That's the picture in your head. Easy captive customers, nobody else for 50 miles, guaranteed traffic on every interstate in the country. Here's the problem. A truck stop is one of the strangest hybrid businesses in America, because on paper you're selling fuel, and fuel is famous for having some of the thinnest margins of any product sold anywhere, sometimes just a few cents a gallon. A truck stop is not really a gas station. It is a logistics hub, a small hotel, a restaurant chain, and a fuel wholesaler all stitched together under one roof. And the moment you understand that fuel is basically the loss leader that gets the truck in the door, everything about how a truck stop actually makes money starts to make sense. Let's start with the price list, because just like every asset we've broken down before, truck stops come in tiers, and the tier you buy into is really a different business wearing the same neon sign. At the bottom sits the small independent fuel stop, a handful of diesel pumps, and a basic convenience store, the kind of operation you can acquire or build for a few $100,000 to a couple $1 million, depending on the market and whether you're buying land or leasing it. Above that sits the mid-size regional truck stop, the kind with a full-service restaurant, a dozen or more showers, a small store selling trucker gear, and enough parking for 80 to 150 trucks overnight, typically requiring anywhere from $5 to $15 million to build from the ground up, once you account for land, fuel infrastructure, and the building itself. At the very top sits the mega travel center, the kind operated by the major national chains, sitting on interchange land the size of several football fields, with dozens of diesel lanes, multiple restaurant brands under one roof, truck repair bays, showers, a small retail store the size of a supermarket, and parking for hundreds of trucks simultaneously, representing tens of millions of dollars in land and construction cost for a single location. Each of these is really a different bet on the same underlying question. Are you trying to capture a trucker for 5 minutes to fill a tank, or are you trying to capture him for an entire mandatory rest period and extract revenue from every single thing he does during those hours? Now here's where the naive mental model falls apart immediately. You assume the money comes from selling diesel. It mostly doesn't, and this is the single most important fact in the entire industry. Diesel fuel margins at the pump are notoriously thin, often just a handful of cents per gallon in gross profit once you account for the wholesale cost of the fuel itself, and truck stop operators are constantly at the mercy of wholesale fuel price swings they have almost no control over. Since crude oil prices, refinery capacity, and regional supply disruptions can move wholesale diesel costs dramatically within days, while the retail price posted on the sign out front often lags behind or gets squeezed by fierce competition from the truck stop across the interchange. Big fleet trucking companies also negotiate fuel discount programs directly with the major chains, locking in bulk pricing that shaves even more off the already thin retail margin, which means a truck stop selling an enormous volume of diesel every single day can still generate a shockingly small dollar amount of actual profit from that fuel alone, sometimes barely enough to cover the cost of running the pumps and the underground storage tanks in the first place. So if fuel isn't where the money is, where does it actually come from? The first real profit engine is the convenience store and food service operation sitting behind the pumps, and this is where the economics flip completely, mirroring almost exactly what we saw inside the amusement park's popcorn stand. A bottle of soda, a bag of chips, a candy bar, or a cup of coffee sold inside that store carries a gross margin that can run 30 to 50% or higher, dramatically better than the pennies on the gallon margin out front. And truckers stopping for a mandatory rest break are a captive audience with real money to spend and genuinely limited alternatives once they've committed to that particular exit. Restaurant operations, whether it's a branded fast food franchise or a full-service diner, generate similarly healthy margins compared to fuel, and a well-run truck stop restaurant open 24 hours a day can become one of the location's most reliable profit centers, because unlike a regular roadside diner competing purely on local foot traffic, a truck stop restaurant has a semi-captive audience of drivers who are legally required to stop and rest at predictable intervals throughout their workday. Then there's a revenue stream almost nobody outside the industry thinks about: showers and parking, and this is genuinely one of the more interesting structural quirks of this business. Federal hours of service regulations require long-haul truck drivers to take mandatory rest breaks after a set number of driving hours, which means demand for overnight truck parking isn't just convenient, it's legally mandated, and truck stops sitting at the right interchange with the right amount of parking capacity have effectively been handed a captive customer base by federal regulation itself. Showers typically get sold as a standalone product, sometimes bundled as a loyalty perk for drivers who buy enough fuel, and while a single shower might only bring in a modest fee, multiply that across dozens of drivers rotating through every single day, and it becomes a meaningful, high-margin revenue line. Since the marginal cost of running one more shower cycle, water heating and cleaning labor, is relatively small compared to what's charged. Parking itself has increasingly become a paid product too, especially at high-demand locations near major metro areas, where legally mandated rest stops don't have nearly enough capacity to meet demand, leading some truck stops to charge premium overnight parking fees purely because trucks genuinely have nowhere else legal to park, a dynamic that starts to resemble the airport parking economics we've covered before, where scarcity itself becomes the product. Now let's talk about what it actually costs to run one of these locations day to day, because the overhead is relentless and multi-layered in a way most standalone businesses never have to deal with simultaneously. Underground fuel storage tanks require constant environmental compliance monitoring, since a leak isn't just an operational headache, it's a potential multi-million-dollar environmental remediation liability if fuel contaminates groundwater, and regulatory requirements around tank testing, leak detection systems, and periodic inspections represent a real ongoing compliance cost that never fully goes away for the life of the property. Insurance for a truck stop reflects the genuine complexity of the operation, covering fuel storage liability, slip and fall risk across a large public-facing retail and restaurant space, and the general liability exposure that comes with hundreds of large commercial vehicles maneuvering through a parking lot every single day, all of which pushes premiums meaningfully higher than a standard small retail business would ever pay. Staffing runs around the clock too, since a real truck stop never closes, meaning payroll has to cover overnight shifts for the convenience store, the restaurant, and often a dedicated fuel desk, a genuinely difficult staffing challenge given how physically demanding and socially isolating overnight retail and food service work can be, contributing to high turnover that forces operators into a near-constant cycle of hiring and training. Location economics in this business work almost exactly opposite to a gym or a landscaping company, where tight local density matters most. Here, what matters is highway traffic volume and, critically, the spacing between your location and the nearest competing truck stop along the same interstate corridor, since a location sitting at a heavily trafficked interchange with genuine distance from the next major truck stop can command significantly better pricing power and occupancy than one squeezed between two aggressive competitors fighting over the exact same pool of passing trucks. This is why the major national chains fight aggressively over specific interchange real estate years in advance of highway expansion projects, understanding that being the only major truck stop within a 50 or 100-mile stretch of interstate is worth dramatically more than being one of three competing options clustered at the same exit. The case studies in this industry tend to fall into two categories worth understanding before anyone signs on a piece of interchange land. The first is the independent operator who built a strong local reputation, competitive fuel pricing through smart wholesale purchasing relationships, and genuinely good food, becoming a preferred stop for regional trucking fleets who route their drivers there specifically, proving that even in an industry dominated by massive national chains, a well-run independent location with real driver loyalty can carve out a genuinely profitable niche. The second is the operator who overbuilt on a speculative highway expansion that never fully materialized the traffic volume projected, or who got squeezed when a major national chain built a larger, better capitalized location at the next exit over, undercutting fuel prices using bulk purchasing power a smaller independent operator simply couldn't match, illustrating how vulnerable this business is to competitive positioning decisions made entirely outside your own control. Time to pull it all together and answer the actual question: how much money do you make if you do this right? In the realistic mid-size scenario, a well-located regional truck stop, generating meaningful daily fuel volume, alongside a genuinely busy restaurant and convenience store, can produce several $1 million in total annual revenue. But because fuel itself contributes such a small share of actual gross profit, despite representing the majority of that revenue on paper, the real net profit margin across the whole operation typically lands in the range of a modest single-digit to low double-digit percentage of total revenue, heavily dependent on how well the non-fuel side of the business, the food, the store, the showers, and the parking, is actually run. In the difficult scenario, a location squeezed by a newly built competitor with better fuel pricing, or one caught during a period of wholesale diesel price volatility that compresses already thin fuel margins even further, can see total profit swing dramatically from one year to the next, even while the number of trucks pulling in stays roughly the same, because so much of the business's actual bottom line depends on the non-fuel spending happening inside that captive rest stop. So if you do decide to buy a truck stop, remember the one thing that actually determines whether you succeed. It was never really about how much diesel you can pump. It's about everything you can sell a driver in the hours he's legally required to stay parked on your property. Because in this business, the fuel gets him in the door, and everything else is where the real money quietly lives.